Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we see that the Russians have made significant advances east of Vuhledar. We see here that the Russians have managed to capture 8 square kilometers of territory in the fields here to the east of Vuhledar. This happens as following as to the Russians capturing some fortified positions along the first lines. This has allowed the Russians to approach the next line of defense fairly quickly with this singular assault from the south and from the east. The Russians have managed to capture several first lines and have managed to reach in on the next Ukrainian line of defense. Following that, there will be no additional lines of defense of the Ukrainians ahead of Vuhledar and the road here in between that and Krasnohorivka. So we're seeing that the Russian positional fighting, which has continued throughout the month of June, is reaching a new stage as Russians are fighting over the last line of defense ahead of the road, after which a larger fight will take place over the towns of Vuhledar, Krasnohorivka and Vodiane, all at the same time across the entirety of this section of the front line. The Russians have been conducting positional fighting here in this section of the front line since the failed assault on Vuhledar in February of 2023, which is now a year and 4 months ago. Following that, the Russians went on to conduct positional fighting in the east, where they managed to capture the town of Novolexandria, to the north Marinka, Pobieda and Krasnohorivka, and have encroached on the Ukrainian positions. Now we're reaching a stage where the only Ukrainian positions left in this area are the ones along the main road here between Vuhledar and Krasnohorivka. The Russians are already so close to the vicinity of this road that it is constantly under fire for any resupply of Vuhledar. This limits the supplies that the Ukrainians are able to send to Vuhledar. There are several roads along the dirt paths here to the north of Vuhledar, where it is connected to Vuhledar, Novolexandria, and so on. However, compared to a paved road, it is limited how much supplies can get through from the northern direction, especially when the rainy season begins again in fall of this year. The current weather makes it obvious that there is no such thing as mud anywhere in Ukraine right now. In the next section of the front line direction of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have now continuously been assaulting the residential area north of the central parts. This shows that they have successfully consolidated their positions in the central parts and are now able to conduct offensive operations north of it, where we see them enter the residential area past the apartment complex area. With this, we see that the Russians will likely continue advancing in the northern parts, and the rate of advances will significantly increase from the time where the fighting was taking place by the apartment complex areas. There are still the apartment complexes here to the east of that and in the eastern outskirts of the city, which means that if they focus on those, then it would still be slow. But if they move along the residential area, they can cut off the supplies to that area by gaining control over this section here along the park in the center of the city. Gaining control over this area here would allow the Russians to completely cut off supplies to the apartment complex area in the eastern outskirts, but this would also mean that they need to capture the apartment complex area here in the center, where the Russians will have to push it through, capture those, and then move along the residential area to the northern parts, where it is split across by a river and marshland. In the Avdiivka section of the front line, we see the Russians have managed to advance in the northern parts of Sokal after consolidating their gains and the fortified positions north of the village. Fighting now continues in the northern and southern parts of Sokal. At the same time, we see positional fighting to the east of Novolexandria, which indicates that the Russians are now moving on to the next stage, which is to assault Novolexandria from 3 separate directions to the south, east, and north of the town. With the capture of Sokal, which it looks like it could happen anytime at this point, the Russians will advance in a southern direction and western direction towards the 2 adjacent villages and down south to the fortified positions north of Novolexandria, as well as likely assaults from Slovyove towards that as a supportive assault. Further north, the Russians have managed to capture Novolexandrivka, where the final parts of it, the western outskirts of it, and fighting continues to take place by the fortified positions to the south and to the west of Novolexandrivka. We see this with this geolocated footage from the Deep State map, which shows Russian soldiers on the very western outskirts of Novolexandrivka, and positional fighting continues with Ukrainian shelling of those soldiers. So we see the Russians are completely under control over Novolexandrivka, whereas they're fighting over the fortified positions. They cannot consolidate their gains yet, but if they do manage to capture fortified positions as well, they'll be able to advance in multiple directions. To the southwest to Lozovetsk, to the northwest towards Vostyshenka, and other directions, as they will allow the Russians to expand their gains from Novolexandrivka. Most fortified positions of the Ukrainians have been passed with the capture of Novolexandrivka, which shows, as we see here, there were multiple layers of Ukrainian fortified lines, and the Russians are now fighting at the third line of defense. Beyond that, there is no coherent line. They are all separate and independent. This means that the Ukrainians would not be allowed to conduct such an organized defense as they have been doing so far, and will be more individualized. In such situation, it is better for the attacking force, because the attacking force is the one that has the initiative, and with the initiative they can concentrate forces in one direction to capture that one by one when the defenses are individualized, while if it is coherent, it is more difficult to do so, as the Ukrainians would be able to quickly move between the different positions as they have one coherent line. So this is something that works to the advantage of the Russians, that the situation has changed in that regard. Further north here in the direction of Pivishne, in the Toretsk section of the front line, the Russians have expanded their zone of control, gaining a foothold within the residential area towards the next line of Ukrainian defense here east of Toretsk, and they've managed to capture the southernmost parts of the canal here in between Toretsk and the north. So we see that the Russians are now gaining control over an area that they have not really had control of since 2014. The Russians with this can now pressure to gain control over the final parts of the southern parts of the canal line. This will allow the Russians to focus the entirety of their forces in the northern direction towards Drushba, Pivnishne, and in the direction of Toretsk, as they would not have to worry about the northern flank, as they'll have the canal line as a defensive position. This shows that the Russians' position have significantly improved ahead of the storming of Toretsk. So we're seeing the developments here in the section of the front line points towards a large assault in the scale of the Battle of Avdiivka, as the Russians will need that much troops to push in the direction of Toretsk. And it seems that with the positional fighting we're currently seeing, that the Russians are planning on such an operation. This means that the Ukrainians have to respond in one of two ways. They either have to consolidate their positions and withdraw from these forward positions to strengthen their back line, or they would have to send additional reinforcements to the city of Toretsk, which is currently thinly spread across the front due to the Russian Kharkiv offensive. So we're seeing that positional fighting takes place east of Toretsk, which has significantly improved the Russian positions in the area. In the Rosolivka section, the Russians have also managed to advance slightly within the village itself. This shows that the positions in the eastern outskirts have been consolidated, and the Russians have improved their positions within Rosolivka. This was seen with a Russian soldier raising the flag of the Russian Federation within the village. So we see that positional fighting continues. The Russians have gained access to the western outskirts of Rosolivka and now have advanced within the eastern parts. They are likely looking to connect the two sides to the east and to the west to strengthen the positions in the south and push through towards the northern parts and gain full control over Rosolivka. So we're seeing positional fighting continues here as well. In the north, there's not a lot of updates, but we do have these two videos of FA, and will allow the Russians to make use of that at the front line to conduct breakthroughs, or as it has been used so far, to hit large concentrations of Ukrainian forces in the different areas of the front line. If the Russians are able to use it all across the front line, it will significantly improve the position and the situation of their frontline soldiers. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.